Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku could feel every death in the world, in real time. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The Aaron Heights Alliance was a strange, fragile thing. A week had passed since the students of Class 1A had moved into the dorms, a week since the Battle of Kamino had shattered the sky and retired the symbol of peace. Hope was the official curriculum, a forced and brittle optimism plastered over the cracks of a world that suddenly felt much larger and more dangerous. They cooked together, studied together, and slept under the same roof, a makeshift family forged in the crucible of a national trauma. But in the quiet moments, in the space between conversations, the tension was palpable. It was the collective breath-holding of a generation that had just learned their greatest shield was, in fact, mortal. For Izuku Midoriya, the silence was the loudest part. He sat at his all-might-themed desk, the Silver Age grin of his idol staring back at him from a dozen different posters and figurines. The smile that had once been a boundless source of inspiration now felt like an accusation. "I am here," it used to say. Now it just whispered, "I am not." The weight of it was a physical thing, a pressure behind his sternum that had nothing to do with One for All. He had been there. He had seen the withered form, the defiant, skeletal arm raised in victory one last time. He was a part of the reason All Might's fire had been extinguished for good. He knew logically that All for One was the cause, that he and his friends had been pawns in a much older, darker game. But logic was a poor balm for a wound this deep. The responsibility he felt was a phantom limb, an ache for a power he hadn't fully possessed, a power he now had to master in a world without its greatest champion. "It is your turn." All Might's words echoed in his memory, not as a glorious passing of the torch, but as a terrifyingly heavy sentence. "Midoriya? You've been staring at that same page for 10 minutes. Izuku jumped, his chair scraping against the floor. Ida stood in his open doorway, hand-chopping the air with his usual rigid precision. "While I admire your dedication to your English studies, optimal learning requires periodic breaks to allow the brain to process information. We are about to commence a group study session in the common area." Right, Ida. "Sorry, I was just thinking." Uraraka peeked around Ida's shoulder, her expression soft with concern. "You okay, Deku? You've been really quiet." The concern in her voice was a sharp pang of guilt. They were all dealing with Kamino. Bakugo was dealing with it, his explosive anger now simmering with a new, unsettling focus. Todoroki was quieter, more watchful. They were all coping, but Izuku felt isolated in his grief, locked in a private room with the ghost of his mentor's career. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile that felt thin and unnatural. "Just tired. Let's go study." The common room was an island of determined normalcy. Sato had baked a mountain of cookies. Kaminari and Siro were failing to teach Bakugo a new card game, mostly by dodging the small, contained explosions that erupted every time he lost a hand, and Yagorozu was patiently explaining complex chemistry to a rapt Mina and Jiro. It was warm. It was safe. It was everything they were supposed to be fighting for. Izuku tried to let the warmth seep into his bones, to let the easy chatter of his friends drown out the roaring monologue in his own head. But even here, the silence found him. He would look at Ida's determined face and see the shadow of staying. He'd see Uraraka's bright smile and remember her terror during the Vanguard Action Squad's attack. These were the people he had to protect. The weight pressed down again, heavier than ever. He had to be stronger. He had to be better. He had to be worthy of the embers he now carried. Later that night, long after the last lights in the dorm had winked out, Izuku stood in the middle of Training Ground Gamma. The vast, industrial labyrinth of pipes and platforms was silent and stark under the cold wash of the moon. The official curfew had passed hours ago, but Aizawa-sensei had given him reluctant permission for late-night sessions, provided he didn't break anything, including himself. It was a trust Izuku was terrified of violating and desperate to live up to. He planted his feet, the scarred soles of his worn sneakers gripping the concrete. He took a deep, shuddering breath, calling forth the crackling green energy of One for All. It swirled around him, a storm of power he could barely contain, lightning arcing from limb to limb. 5%. Full cowling. It was his base now, a comfortable hum of power that felt like a second skin. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough to face what was coming. He had to push past it. 8%. The power surged, a low growl in his bones. The green light intensified, and he could feel the strain, a tight coiling in his muscles. He ran through a sequence of kicks and punches, his movements a blur. The air whistled with each strike. He felt the familiar burn, the protest of muscle fibers being pushed to their absolute limit. This pain was good. This pain was productive. It was a pain he could control, a pain that was making him stronger. It was the only thing that could quiet the voice in his head. He pushed himself for what felt like hours, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his lungs heaving. His body screamed for rest, but his mind screamed louder for progress. More. Faster. Stronger. You have to be ready. He was in the middle of a complex aerial maneuver, launching himself off a high platform to practice a mid-air strike. When it happened, it was not a physical sensation. It was not the sharp, familiar pain of a miscalculated landing or a muscle pushed too far. This was alien. It was a sharp, stabbing cold that punched through the center of his chest, utterly independent of his body. For a split second, the roaring energy of One for All vanished, replaced by a profound and terrifying void. The vibrant green of his quirk flickered, and the world seemed to gray out at the edges. With the cold came a phantom feeling, not a memory, but an immediate, visceral impression. He felt a sudden, crushing tightness in his own chest, a frantic, confused struggle for breath that wasn't his. There was a ghostly image behind his eyes of a peeling floral wallpaper, the smell of dust and stale tea, and a wave of profound, weary confusion. A life of 87 years, a wife gone for a decade, a son who never called, a whole existence flickered and then went out. Like a candle flame snuffed between thumb and forefinger. The sensation lasted no longer than a single, ragged heartbeat. Gah! Izuku's concentration shattered. His control over One for All winked out completely. Gravity reasserted its dominance with brutal authority, and he plummeted the last 10 feet, landing in a graceless, painful heap. His shoulder hit the concrete with a sickening thud, and real, honest-to-God pain flooded his nerves, eclipsing the strange psychic chill. He lay there for a full minute, gasping, the dull ache in his shoulder a grounding presence. What was that? He sat up, probing the joint. It wasn't dislocated, just badly bruised. But his mind was racing, trying to process the other feeling. Must be exhaustion, he concluded, rubbing his chest. The cold spot was gone, leaving only a lingering unease, like the memory of a bad dream. Pushing my quirk too hard. Some kind of weird psychic feedback from One for All. It was the only explanation that made sense. His quirk was a unique and mysterious beast, a conglomeration of past users' wills and powers. Maybe, in a moment of extreme stress, he had brushed up against the vestiges memory of a past injury. Or maybe his own body, under the immense strain, was just sending him bizarre, crossed signals. He took a few deep breaths, shook his head to clear it, and decided to call it a night. The strange feeling was unsettling, but the physical pain in his shoulder was a more immediate concern. He limped back to the dorms, the phantom chill already fading into the background, dismissed as a freak side effect of his relentless pursuit of strength. He was wrong. 2 days later, the phantom chimes began to ring with more frequency. The first recurrence happened in the middle of a lecture on hero law. Izuku was diligently taking notes, his pen scratching across the page, when a sudden, violent jolt shot through his brain. It wasn't cold this time. It was a hot, sharp shriek of pure, undiluted terror. It was accompanied by the screech of twisting metal, the smell of gasoline, and a brief, blinding flash of oncoming headlights. Then, an instantaneous, brutal silence. The feeling was so jarring that his pen flew from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. Midoriya? Is there a problem? Aizawa-sensei's voice was a low, tired drone from the front of the class. His eyes narrowed behind his capture weapon. Izuku flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. The entire classroom was staring at him. He could feel his face flush a deep, mortified red. And no, sensei! Sorry! Dropped my pen. He fumbled for the pen, his hand trembling slightly. The sensation was gone as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the ghost of an adrenaline spike and a coppery taste in his mouth. He tried to focus on the lecture, but the words blurred together. A car crash, he thought, a cold dread seeping into him. That felt exactly like a car crash. But how could he possibly know that? It happened again that evening. He was in the kitchen, helping Sato measure out flour for yet another batch of therapeutic baked goods. This time, it was different. It was a soft sigh, a gentle, peaceful fading. It felt like letting go of a rope he'd been clutching for a long, long time. There was a sense of relief, of a journey's end, overlaid with the faint, sterile smell of antiseptic and the muted beeping of distant machinery. It was so subtle, so quiet, that he barely registered it until it was over. He paused, his hand hovering over the flour sack, a strange, unearned melancholy settling over him for a moment before dissipating like mist. "You good, man?" Sato asked, noticing his hesitation. "Yeah," Izuku mumbled, shaking his head. "Just spaced out for a second." He was no longer so sure it was just exhaustion. This was something else. A paranoia began to take root in the fertile soil of his anxiety. He started to feel like a radio, unwillingly picking up stray signals from some unknown, terrifying broadcast. He became jumpy, flinching at loud noises, constantly checking over his shoulder, as if expecting to see the source of these psychic intrusions. His friends noticed the change. "You've got dark circles under your eyes, Karo," Tsuyu observed bluntly during lunch, her finger tapping her chin. "You're not sleeping, are you?" Todoroki asked, his heterochromatic eyes studying Izuku with an unnerving intensity. "Is it about All Might? I'm sleeping. I'm fine, really," Izuku insisted, picking at his katsudon with a distinct lack of appetite. "Just a lot on my mind," he couldn't tell them. How could he possibly explain it? "Hey guys, sometimes I randomly feel people dying. Pass the soy sauce?" They would think he was losing his mind. Recovery Girl would put him on medical leave, Aizawa would bench him from training, and All Might would just have one more broken, worrying thing to deal with. So he kept it to himself, a festering secret that made his dorm room feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. He tried to find a pattern. Was it proximity? He felt the car crash and the peaceful death, but he hadn't heard any sirens or seen any news reports about local incidents. Was it tied to his quirk usage? He'd been completely relaxed in the kitchen when the gentle fading occurred. There was no rhyme or reason, just these sporadic, horrifying chimes from an invisible bell, each one tolling the end of a life he'd never known. The uncertainty was a unique form of torture. He was a creature of analysis, a boy who had filled 13 notebooks with detailed dissections of quirks and heroes. He tackled problems by observing, documenting, and theorizing. But how could he analyze a ghost? How could he deconstruct a feeling? He felt helpless, adrift in a sea of terrifying, inexplicable sensations. His nights became a gauntlet of anxiety. He lay in bed, staring at his all-might-covered ceiling, bracing himself for the next phantom pain, the next psychic scream. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and dreamless, offering no respite. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Saturday evening. The storm outside mirrored the one in Izuku's head. Rain lashed against the windows of the common room, and distant thunder rumbled like a grumpy giant. Inside, however, a determined sense of coziness prevailed. A movie was playing on the large television, some cheesy American action flick Kaminari had insisted on. Most of the class was sprawled across the couches and floor cushions, wrapped in blankets, sharing bowls of popcorn. Izuku was wedged on a couch between Uraraka and Ida, a blanket pulled up to his chin. He was trying desperately to just be a normal teenager for a few hours. He was trying to focus on the ridiculous plot of the movie, on the buttery smell of the popcorn, on Ida's running commentary about the film's blatant disregard for the laws of physics. He was almost succeeding. He just laughed at a joke Uraraka whispered in his ear when the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a single chime this time. It wasn't a whisper or a shriek. It was a wave. A psychic tsunami. A symphony of death crashed down on him all at once. Screams of terror, so many of them, overlapping into a single, high-pitched wail of agony. The gut-wrenching feeling of falling. The searing heat of an explosion, a flash of white-hot pain. The sharp, percussive shockwaves of gunfire. the cold, wet terror of drowning. The choking dust of collapsing concrete. Panic. Confusion. The sudden, brutal severing of dozens of life threads at the exact same instant. It was a chorus of endings, a tidal wave of final moments, and it slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. The colors of the common room bleached to a blinding, painful white. The sounds of the movie, the rain, the laughter of his friends, all of it was swallowed by a deafening roar in his mind, his nervous system overloaded. A guttural, agonized scream was torn from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that had nothing to do with the B-movie on the screen. He convulsed, tumbling from the couch onto the floor. His hands flew to his head, fingers digging into his scalp as if he could physically claw the screaming out of his skull. DKU, Midoriya! The room erupted into chaos. The movie was forgotten. Popcorn scattered across the rug. His friends were on their feet, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. Ida was at his side first, his hands hovering, unsure of how to help. Midoriya, what is it? Are you injured? Is it your quirk? Uraraka knelt beside him, her face pale, her hands trembling. Deku, what's wrong? Talk to us. But Izuku couldn't talk. He couldn't breathe. He was drowning in it. The psychic echo of the event was still reverberating through him, a phantom carnage replaying behind his eyelids. He could feel the empty spaces where lives had just been, a constellation of fresh, gaping voids in the fabric of the world. 20? 30? More? He couldn't count. It was too many. He was curled in a tight, fetal position on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. A low, continuous moan escaped his lips. Vaguely, through the fog of psychic agony, he was aware of Bakugo's shouting, of Kirishima trying to clear the area, of Yaoyoro's panicked voice suggesting they call Aizawa-sensei immediately. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. It came from the television. We interrupt this program with breaking news. A stern-faced news anchor appeared on the screen, a graphic flashing over her shoulder. Breaking news. Terrorist attack in Brussels. Todoroki, ever the calm center in a storm, was the one who turned up the volume. The anchor's voice filled the stunned silence of the common room. Reports are just coming in from Brussels, Belgium, where a coordinated villain attack has targeted the city's central train station during rush hour. Eyewitnesses report multiple, massive explosions followed by gunfire. The situation is still developing, but early reports indicate a catastrophic loss of life. Emergency services are overwhelmed. Izuku's moaning stopped. He forced his eyes open, lifting his head just enough to see the screen. The first shaky, cell phone footage was being broadcast. Smoke billowed from the shattered glass facade of a grand, old-world station. People were running, screaming. The images were a perfect, horrifying match for the sensory nightmare that had just ripped through his mind. The heat. The falling. The screams. A cold, bottomless dread washed over him, even more terrifying than the pain itself. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his body still trembling violently. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the television screen. The anchor's voice was somber. While official numbers have not yet been released, sources on the ground are estimating at least 24 fatalities, with that number expected to rise, 24. The number hit him like another physical blow. That was it. That was the wave. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a stress response. It wasn't some strange quirk-related feedback loop. His gaze shifted from the television to the horrified, concerned faces of his friends surrounding him. They were looking at him, a boy who had collapsed screaming on the floor for no apparent reason. But then their eyes would flick to the television, to the report of a tragedy happening thousands of kilometers away, and a flicker of impossible, terrifying understanding would dawn in their expressions. They saw him scream, and then the news broke. Izuku stared back at them, the truth settling in his soul like a block of ice. He had felt it. He had felt every single one of them die. In real time. From across the world. The warmth of the common room was gone, replaced by an arctic chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The hope they had all been clinging to felt like a cruel joke. His dream, his lifelong, all-consuming dream, had always been to save everyone. To be the pillar of hope that all might had been. But as he lay on the floor, the phantom screams of 24 strangers still echoing in the hollows of his mind, he was slammed with a horrifying, world-shattering realization. He couldn't save them. He couldn't even save himself from the knowledge of their passing. His great gift, the sacred torch of One for All, had just revealed a new and terrible aspect of its power. It had connected him to the world in the most intimate and agonizing way imaginable. He was no longer just a hero in training, fighting to protect the innocent from villains. He was now a helpless witness, a living antenna for the planet's grief. He looked at Uraraka's terrified, tear-filled eyes, and a new kind of fight began to dawn within him, one far more impossible than any battle against a villain. He was now fighting against an unending, unwinnable, mathematical certainty. He was fighting fate itself. And the first chime had just rung. The silence in the common room was a new and terrible thing. It wasn't the comfortable, sleepy silence of a late Saturday night. It was a vacuum, born from the sonic boom of Izuku's scream and the subsequent, horrifying revelation on the television. The cheesy action movie was a forgotten relic of a simpler time, a time that had existed only 5 minutes ago. Now, there was only the rain, the somber voice of the news anchor, and the ragged, shallow gasps of the boy curled on the floor. Shota Aizawa arrived like a wraith, his capture weapon already coiling loosely around his neck, his eyes glowing a faint, menacing red as if he'd been prepared to nullify a threat. But the scene that greeted him was not one of villainy. It was one of communal shock, his students clustered together like frightened sheep, their eyes fixed on their trembling classmate. "What happened?" Aizawa's voice was a low growl that cut through the paralysis. It was Yayorozu who answered, her voice trembling but precise. "We were watching a movie. Midoriya, he just screamed. He collapsed. We thought it was a seizure or his quirk." She gestured with a shaking hand towards the television. And then, the news report started. It was almost simultaneous. Aizawa's gaze flickered from Izuku to the screen, where the burning shell of the Brussels station was displayed in grim detail. His logical mind, trained to find patterns and causality, immediately started trying to connect the two impossible data points. Midoriya screams. A continent away, people die. It was a correlation so absurd it bordered on insanity. He knelt, his movements economical and devoid of panic. "Midoriya," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Look at me." Izuku's head lolled to the side. His eyes, wide and unfocused, were like shattered glass. The psychic residue of the attack was fading, but it left behind a profound, soul-deep exhaustion and a nausea that churned in his gut. The faces of his friends swam in his vision, Ida's rigid concern, Uraraka's tear-streaked face, Todoroki's unnerving stillness, Bakugo's. Bakugo's expression was the most unsettling. It was a tense, pinched look of confusion and something that almost resembled fear. He wasn't yelling. He was just watching, processing. "Can you tell me what you felt?" Aizawa asked, his tone that of a detective, not a teacher. Izuku's throat was raw. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He swallowed, the simple act feeling monumental. I felt it," he whispered, the words barely audible. The explosions, the falling. I heard them, in my head." He looked at Aizawa, his expression pleading. "Sensei, I felt them die." The confession hung in the air, fragile and monstrous. Aizawa's expression didn't change, but Izuku could see a flicker of something in his tired eyes, not disbelief, but a deep, troubled concern. He'd seen a lot of things. He'd seen quirks that warped reality, that twisted bodies, that rewrote minds. But this was something new. A quirk that served as a global obituary column. "All right," Aizawa said, his voice a steady anchor in the churning sea of Izuku's panic. "Let's get you to recovery, girl. Everyone else, back to your rooms." Now, the order was absolute, and though his classmates hesitated, a sharp glare from their teacher sent them scattering, casting worried glances over their shoulders. All Might, who had arrived moments after Aizawa, his skeletal form wrapped in a heavy coat, helped Aizawa get Izuku to his feet. The world swayed, and Izuku leaned heavily on his mentor, his body feeling like a hollowed-out shell. The touch was meant to be reassuring, but for Izuku, it was just another reminder of the fragility of the man beside him, another life he was terrified of feeling extinguish. The infirmary was a sterile white box, smelling faintly of antiseptic and chamomile tea. It was a place of healing, of mending broken bones and soothing battered muscles. But the ailment Izuku carried was not one recovery girl could fix with a kiss. She ran a battery of tests. His vitals were erratic, heart rate elevated, blood pressure spiking and falling, but there were no physical injuries. She scanned his brain, searching for anomalies, for tumors, for any sign of neurological damage that could explain such a profound, sensory hallucination. She found nothing. Physically, he's just exhausted and suffering from shock, she said, her voice tight with professional frustration. She handed Izuku a cup of herbal tea, her brow furrowed. Whatever this is, dearie, it's not in your body. Aizawa stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the wall. All Might sat in a chair beside Izuku's cot, looking gaunt and helpless. They had decided to keep this quiet, to contain the madness of the situation to this small room. Midoriya, my boy, All Might began, his voice soft and laced with a deep, paternal worry. You've been under an incredible amount of stress. The Kamino incident, my retirement. One for all is a quirk intrinsically tied to the user's emotional state. It's possible that the trauma has caused a new, unpredictable manifestation, a form of extreme, empathetic feedback. It was the most logical explanation they could formulate. A new quirk born of trauma. PTSD with superpowers. A psychological break made manifest. It made sense. It was rational, and it was completely, utterly wrong. It's not feedback, Izuku said, his voice flat. He stared into his teacup, watching the steam curl and dissipate. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't just a feeling. It was real. It was happening. He looked up, his eyes meeting Aizawa's. This isn't the first time. He told them everything. He told them about the cold stab of the old man's heart attack during his late-night training, the phantom sensation of peeling wallpaper and confusion. He told them about the hot shriek of the car crash during class, the smell of gasoline. He told them about the soft, peaceful sigh in the kitchen. Each incident, when recounted aloud, sounded more and more like the ramblings of a lunatic. He saw it in their faces, the pity, the concern, the gentle disbelief. They were trying to understand, but they were filtering his words through the lens of what was possible, and what he was describing lay far outside that realm. It's not just a feeling of sadness, All Might, Izuku insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. It's an information transfer. I felt the way they died. The Brussels attack, it was too specific, too clear. Aizawa pushed himself off the wall. Midoriya, let's consider this logically. You're describing a quirk with a global range that activates for every single human death. Do you have any idea what that number is? On average, nearly 2 people die every second. Over 100,000 every day. If what you were describing were true, you wouldn't be coherent. You wouldn't be sitting here talking to us. You'd be in a permanent state of catatonic shock from the sheer, unending volume of it. Aizawa's logic was a cold, sharp knife. And it was flawless. Izuku opened his mouth to argue, but he had no counter. He should be catatonic. Why wasn't he? Why was it only sporadic? Why were some deaths loud and others quiet? Was he wrong? Was it all just in his head? For a moment, he clung to that possibility. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just stress. A horrifyingly vivid, but ultimately psychological, episode. It was a comforting thought. It meant he wasn't broken, just hurt. It meant he could be fixed. The comfort lasted for exactly 3 seconds. As Aizawa was speaking, a new chime rang in the back of his mind. It was faint, distant. A tired, resigned feeling of lungs filling with water, the cold shock of a river in winter, and a final, gurgling breath. A suicide. Somewhere far away. It was a mere whisper on the edge of his consciousness, almost lost beneath the fluorescent hum of the infirmary lights. He didn't scream this time. He didn't collapse. He just flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through his body. His grip on the teacup tightened, his knuckles turning white. It was still happening. Aizawa was right about the numbers. The thought was staggering. But he was wrong about the result. Izuku was feeling it. Maybe not everything, not yet. Or maybe the faint, whisper-thin pains were the ones he'd been dismissing as stray thoughts or pangs of anxiety for weeks. Maybe the broadcast was always on, and he was only just now learning how to hear it. He said nothing. He just nodded mutely at Aizawa's assessment. Arguing was pointless. They couldn't help him. No one could. He was on his own with this. He was patient zero of an epidemic of one. They sent him back to his room with strict orders. No training for 48 hours, a mandatory appointment with the school counselor, and he was to report any further episodes immediately. He agreed to everything, the lies tasting like ash in his mouth. His room, once a shrine to his greatest inspiration, now felt like a prison cell. The grinning face of All Might seemed to mock him, a symbol of a simple, noble heroism that was now utterly beyond his reach. How could he focus on saving people from villains when he was being bombarded by the mundane, unpreventable hand of fate itself? He sat on his bed, the silence of the dorm pressing in on him. But it wasn't truly silent. Now that he was listening for it, he could feel it. A low-grade, persistent hum in the back of his consciousness. It was like psychic static, a constant, faint thrum of endings. It was the background radiation of mortality. Aizawa's number echoed in his head, 100,000 per day. This was the sound of it. This was the chorus. The individual deaths were the spikes. The sharp notes that rose above the din. A sudden, sharp sting of a drug overdose in a Tokyo alley. A drawn-out, wheezing fade of pneumonia from a hospital in Osaka. A flash of agony from a construction accident across town. They came without warning, tiny psychic papercuts, each one a stark reminder of the curse that had awakened within him. Denial was no longer an option. This was real. His analytical mind, the part of him that had filled notebooks with meticulous detail, kicked into gear. It was a defense mechanism, a way to impose order on the chaos that was threatening to drown him. If he couldn't stop it, maybe he could understand it. He couldn't fight it, but he could study it. He turned to his desk, pushing aside his school textbooks. He pulled out a fresh, empty notebook, one of the dozens he kept in reserve. Its clean, crisp pages were a stark contrast to the morbid purpose he had in mind. On the cover, where he normally would have written, Hero Analysis for the Future, number 14. He hesitated. He stared at the blank space for a long moment before his pen moved, scratching out 2 words in neat, shaky katakana, Death Ledger. He opened it to the first page. His hands trembled, but his purpose was clear. He needed data. He needed confirmation. He needed to prove to himself that he wasn't insane. He booted up his laptop, the bright light of the screen making him wince. He started with the Brussels attack. He pulled up international news sites, BBC, Reuters, Associated Press, and began to read every article, every eyewitness account, every preliminary report. The official death toll was now 27. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He'd felt a wave of more than 2 dozen. It was a match, but that wasn't enough. It was too big, too vague. He needed to track the smaller ones. The chimes. The whispers. He tuned his senses, focusing past the background hum, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. A new feeling pricked at his awareness. A sharp, sudden blow to the back of the head, a flash of surprise and betrayal. And then nothing. It was violent. A murder. And it felt close. Relatively speaking, within the city. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He searched for online police scanners for the Musudafu prefecture. It took him 10 minutes of frantic searching through forums and sketchy websites, but he found one. A tinny, distorted voice crackled through his laptop speakers. A litany of codes and addresses. Possible 187 at the address on file. Officers responding. Suspect may be armed and on foot, a 187. The homicide code. His blood ran cold. He quickly looked up the address mentioned. It was a small apartment complex in a residential district about 5 kilometers from Ye. He wrote it down in his notebook, next to the time and a short, clinical description, blunt force trauma to the head. Surprise. Male, approximate 40s. He had no idea how he knew the age, it was just part of the psychic data packet. He sat there, staring at the entry, his heart pounding. It was one thing to feel it. It was another to see it logged in cold, hard text. A life, reduced to a line item in his horrifying new ledger. He spent the rest of the night like that, a grim sentinel at his desk. He became a vulture, circling the globe from his desk chair, feeding on the scraps of tragedy he could find online. A soft, fading sensation, tinged with the scent of chemicals. Cross-references with hospital obituaries in the Chiba prefecture. Match. Female, 78, liver failure. A brief, fiery burst of pain followed by crushing pressure. Searches for traffic accidents. Finds a local news report about a motorcycle crash on the Wangan Expressway. Match. Male, 22. The scale of it began to dawn on him, and it was a physical weight. Aizawa's logic had been both right and wrong. He wasn't feeling every death. Not yet. It was like his quirk was still calibrating, its range and sensitivity fluctuating wildly. But even this filtered, partial feed was overwhelming. He felt a cluster of deaths from a mudslide in the Philippines, a report of which surfaced on a global disaster monitoring site 20 minutes later. He felt the sharp, precise end of a gang-related shooting in Chicago, confirmed by a news ticker scrolling along the bottom of an American news stream. He felt the slow, agonizing suffocation of a miner trapped in a collapsed shaft in South Africa, an event that wouldn't make international news for hours. The world was dying, constantly, in 1,000 different ways, and he was the sole audience for every single performance. The background hum was no longer static. It was the combined, fading whispers of all the souls he couldn't individually register. It was the sound of a species bleeding out, one person at a time. The ticker, that's what it was. An unending, remorseless ticker tape of death scrolling behind his eyes. He filled page after page of his new notebook. The neat, analytical entries grew more frantic, the handwriting devolving into a desperate scrawl. He was a man drowning, trying to catalog the individual drops of water that were filling his lungs. It was a mad, pointless, all-consuming task. And he couldn't stop. Sometime before dawn, hunched over his desk, surrounded by the bluish glow of multiple browser windows, a new death chime rang. And this one shattered his detached, analytical facade to pieces. This one was familiar. It wasn't the death itself, but the life attached to it. The psychic signature, the unique frequency of the soul being extinguished, was one he recognized. The feeling was one of shock and sudden, searing pain. A villain attack. The sensation was of being stretched, pulled apart like taffy, a grotesque, elastic agony. It was fast, brutal, and came with a final, panic thought that wasn't a word but an image, the smiling face of a young daughter. But beneath the horror of the death was the identity. Izuku's breath hitched. His eyes widened. He knew that feeling. He knew that life. Slide go. His real name was Kenji Tsurigami. A minor pro-hero from a neighboring prefecture whose quirk allowed him to turn any surface into a low-friction slide, letting him move with incredible speed and evacuate civilians with surprising efficiency. He wasn't a top 10 hero. He wasn't a household name. But he was a hero, and Izuku had met him. A memory, sharp and vivid, surfaced from the depths of his childhood. He was 9 years old, a small, quirkless boy at a local hero convention, clutching an autograph book. Slide Go had been there, manning a small, overlooked booth between some bigger-name heroes. No one was paying him much attention, but Izuku, with his encyclopedic knowledge, had run up to him, babbling about a specific rescue Slide Go had performed, one involving a runaway Ferris wheel. The hero had been so surprised and genuinely touched. He had knelt down, his smile wide and kind, and spent 10 minutes talking to the small, freckled boy. He'd given him an autograph, drawing a little cartoon of himself sliding down a rainbow. "Never stop watching, kid," he'd said, ruffling Izuku's messy green hair. "It's the folks who pay attention that make all this worth it." That man. That kind, earnest hero who had shown a moment of grace to a quirkless child. The life force that had beamed at him with such warmth. He had just felt it be shredded apart. The abstract horror became gut-wrenchingly, violently real. The deaths in his notebook were no longer just data points. They were people. They were Kenji Tsurigami, who had a daughter he loved. They were the old man with the peeling wallpaper, the young man on the motorcycle, the countless faceless others. The room began to spin. The ticker in his head swelled from a hum to a roar. The notebook, his anchor of logic, now seemed like a grotesque insult, a sterile record of immeasurable pain. He scrambled back from his desk, knocking his chair over. He stumbled towards the small bathroom attached to his dorm room, his hand clamped over his mouth. He didn't make it. He collapsed to his knees in the middle of his room, right in front of a Silver Age All Might poster, and vomited. The retching was a violent, full-body spasm, his stomach trying to expel a sickness that wasn't in it. He was trying to purge a feeling, to throw up a memory that wasn't his. He was left kneeling there, trembling and gasping, the acrid smell of bile filling the air. Tears streamed down his face, silent and hot. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, undiluted horror. The first time had been a shock. The wave of death from Brussels had been a cataclysm. But this was the moment the curse truly took hold. This was the moment he understood that every single tick of the unending counter, every whisper, every scream, was a person. A story. A life. A 9-year-old fantasy hero. He looked at the open ledger on his desk. His mission was no longer to understand. His mission was no longer just to document. A new, terrible, and impossible thought began to form in the ruins of his mind. If he could feel them die, then maybe, just maybe, he could get there first. The fight against fate had its first, desperate, and utterly doomed strategy. And Izuku Midoriya, the boy who wanted to save everyone, had just taken his first step on a path that would lead not to heroism, but to self-destruction. The 2 days of mandated rest were a special kind of hell. Izuku existed in a liminal space, a ghost haunting the hallways of Heights Alliance. He attended his classes, his body present in the chair but his mind adrift on a global ocean of sorrow. He ate his meals in the common room, the cheerful chatter of his friends a muffled, distant broadcast from another world. He smiled when spoken to, a twitch of muscles around his mouth that didn't reach his haunted eyes. He was a perfect mimic of a living boy. Inside, however, a frantic, desperate calculus was running. The ticker was a constant companion now. He was learning its language, its rhythms. The background hum was the baseline of global mortality, the planet's slow, steady heartbeat of decay. He learned to distinguish the textures of the psychic static. The soft, weary sigh of old age. The sharp, metallic tang of violence. The slow, suffocating fade of disease. He was becoming a connoisseur of endings. The spikes, the clear, distinct chimes of individual deaths, were what he focused on. They were his obsession. His death ledger, now hidden under a loose floorboard beneath his bed, was filling with grim, cross-referenced entries. He spent every waking moment not under the direct supervision of a teacher glued to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard, a digital ghoul chasing headlines and police reports to confirm the whispers in his soul. Sleep offered no escape. He would lie in his bed, the grinning face of All Might on his wall a silent, judging sentinel, and listen. A car crash in Germany. An elderly woman falling down the stairs in her home in Kyoto. A gang initiation gone wrong in Los Angeles. Each one was a tiny, sharp pinprick in his consciousness. He didn't sleep, he kept vigil. By the time his 48-hour rest period was over, the dark circles under his eyes were chasms. His mandatory session with Hound Dog, the school's counselor, had been a masterclass in deflection. The pro-hero, with his canine features and unnervingly sharp sense of smell, could likely send the anxiety pouring off Izuku. But Izuku, channeling a desperation he didn't know he possessed, framed his trauma in the context of Kamino. He spoke of the pressure, the fear, the weight of All Might's legacy. He gave the counselor a neat, plausible, and incomplete truth. He walked out with a pamphlet on stress management techniques, and a follow-up appointment he had no intention of keeping in good faith. He was cleared to resume training. The lie felt heavy in his gut, but it was a necessary one. Because a new, terrifying, and wildly arrogant idea had taken root in the barren soil of his despair: prevention. His quirk was a curse, a passive feed of tragedy. But what if he could make it active? What if he could use the information? The ticker told him when people died. But sometimes, in the moments leading up to a violent or accidental death, he could feel a build-up. A psychic precursor. A crescendo of panic, fear, or malice that preceded the final, silent note. It was a storm front he could see gathering on his internal horizon. If he could feel it coming, maybe he could outrun it. The thought was intoxicating. It was a flicker of agency in a sea of helplessness. It was a way to fight back, not just against villains, but against the grim, random machinery of fate itself. It was a chance to turn the worst thing that had ever happened to him into a tool, into a new form of heroism. It was a chance to finally, truly, save someone. He just needed an opportunity. He just needed a death that was close enough, clear enough, and preventable enough. He didn't have to wait long. It was a Tuesday night, just after 9 p.m. The dorm was quiet, most students sequestered in their rooms studying for upcoming midterms. Izuku sat at his desk, pretending to read a chapter on constitutional hero law, but his real focus was turned inward, his senses scanning the psychic landscape. The global hum was its usual, somber thrum. A few distant, unremarkable spikes, a post-surgery complication in India, a boating accident off the coast of Australia, pricked at him, but they were too far away, too indistinct. He was a fisherman waiting for a bite, his line cast into the abyss. Then he felt it. It started not as a death, but as a spark of pure, unadulterated panic. It was a feeling so sharp and so close it made him jolt upright in his chair, his textbook sliding to the floor with a loud thump. This wasn't a distant whisper from another continent. This was in the neighborhood. Maybe a dozen blocks away. The panic was primal. It was the frantic, animal terror of a mother. With the panic came a sensory cocktail that flooded his mind, the acrid smell of burning plastic, a wave of intense, dry heat, and the sound of a child coughing, a thin, wheezing sound thick with smoke. He closed his eyes, concentrating, pushing past the initial wave of fear to the information beneath it. A house fire. It was just starting. He could feel the source, a frayed, ancient electrical cord behind a television, sparking and igniting a dusty curtain. He felt the mother's frantic scramble, her mind racing, torn between finding a fire extinguisher and grabbing her sleeping child. This was it. A preventable death, happening right now, just minutes away. There was no thought. No weighing of options. No consideration of rules or consequences. There was only the feeling of that little boy's coughing, the mother's terror, and the absolute, undeniable imperative to act. He was on his feet before he even registered the decision. His hero costume was locked away, but he didn't need it. He yanked on his worn, red sneakers, his hands moving with a speed and certainty that felt alien. The rules, the UA curfew, the prohibition on unsupervised quirk use off campus, Aizawa's stern warnings, were meaningless static compared to the signal screaming in his head. He threw open his door and sprinted. The dorm was silent. He shot through the common room, a green-haired blur of single-minded purpose. The front doors were locked for the night. He didn't hesitate. One for all, full cowling. 5%. Green lightning crackled around his limbs. He didn't smash the door. He didn't want to leave a trail of destruction. He launched himself at the high, open window above the entryway, a feat of acrobatics that would have been impossible a year ago. He sailed through the opening, landing silently on the damp grass outside, the cool night air a shock to his system. He was free. Now which way? The ticker didn't give him a map, it gave him a direction, a psychic magnetism pulling him toward the event. He paused for a fraction of a second, his head tilted as if listening to a sound no one else could hear, and then he bolted, turning right, heading down the tree-lined street that led away from the UA campus. The world became a tunnel. The neat suburban houses, the manicured lawns, the sleeping cars parked in driveways, they were all just obstacles in a high-stakes obstacle course. He pushed his quirk to 8%, the familiar strain a welcome burn in his muscles. The green arcs of energy around him were a beacon in the night, but he didn't care who saw. His lungs heaved, but it wasn't from exertion. With every step, the psychic broadcast from the house grew stronger, more desperate. He could feel the mother's hope beginning to curdle into despair as the smoke thickened, turning from a hazy gray to a greasy, choking black. He felt her decision, forget the extinguisher, get the boy. He felt her run towards the bedroom, her own lungs starting to burn. Faster, his mind screamed. You have to be faster. He pushed his body harder, his sneakers pounding a frantic rhythm on the pavement. He rounded a corner, his internal compass screaming that he was close. He could smell it now, the real, physical scent of smoke tainting the clean night air. He saw the glow first, a flickering, hellish orange reflected in the windows of the houses across the street. Then he saw the source, a small, two-story home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Smoke wasn't just trickling from the windows anymore. It was billowing, thick and black, pouring from the eaves of the roof. The downstairs living room was a furnace of orange light. He was still 200 meters away. He could see figures on the lawns of neighboring houses, people in pajamas pointing, their faces illuminated by the growing blaze. Someone was on their phone, probably calling the fire department. But the sirens were still a distant, mournful wail. Too far. Too slow. The psychic scream of the mother's death was building, a terrible crescendo in his head. She had reached the child's room. The smoke was a solid thing, hot and blinding. He could feel her disorientation, her lungs screaming for air they couldn't find. He felt her grab her son, a small, limp weight, in her arms. She was turning back, trying to find the hallway, but the superheated air was searing her throat. Her vision was tunneling. Her strength was failing. No. Not yet. Hold on. I'm almost there. He poured every ounce of will and power into a final burst of speed. The last 100 meters vanished in a green blur. He vaulted over a low garden fence, landing on the front lawn just as the living room window exploded outwards in a shower of glass and a roar of superheated air. The heat hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The front of the house was an inferno. The front door was impassable. He scanned the house, his mind racing, processing details with the frantic speed of his quirk. The fire was concentrated on the first floor. The mother and child were on the second, in a back bedroom. There was a large oak tree whose thick branches reached up towards the second-story window. It was his only chance. He took a running start, leaping into the branches of the tree, his reinforced shoes finding purchase on the thick bark. He scrambled upwards, ignoring the scrapes and scratches from smaller branches. He reached the level of the window just as the psychic crescendo in his head reached its peak. He felt the mother's final, desperate gasp. He felt her knees buckle. He felt the small, precious weight of her child slipping from her grasp. He felt her consciousness, her entire world, collapse into a single point of agonizing, fiery pain. And then silence. The psychic connection, the thread of her life he had been following, snapped. The finality of it was absolute. It was a physical blow, a punch to his soul that was infinitely more powerful than the heat rolling off the house. For a split second, his strength vanished. His grip on the tree branch faltered. The world went gray. The roar of the fire, the distant sirens, the shouts of the neighbors, it all faded into a dull, hollow ringing in his ears. He had failed. He had been too slow. He had raced against fate and lost by a matter of seconds. He was standing on a branch, 10 feet from the window, and on the other side of that glass, a life he had been psychically tethered to for the last 3 minutes had just been extinguished. The loss, the raw, undiluted feeling of failure, was a chasm that threatened to swallow him whole. He had felt her hope, her struggle, her final moments. He was a witness to her entire tragedy, from spark to ashes. A small, weak cough from inside the room broke through his stupor. The child. The mother was gone, but the boy was still alive. His own psychic chime hadn't rung yet. The thought galvanized him. He couldn't save her. But he could still save him. Rage, at the fire, at his own slowness, at the universe, surged through him. He wrapped his arm in his jacket, channeled a flicker of one for all into his fist, and punched. The window shattered, the glass falling inwards onto the smoke-filled floor. He vaulted through the opening, landing in a low crouch. The room was an oven. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see the opposite wall. It was like being submerged in black ink. He dropped to the floor, where the air was marginally clearer, and crawled forward, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning with every breath. "Hello?" he choked out, his voice a raw rasp. "Can you hear me?" Another weak cough, to his left. He crawled towards the sound, his hands sweeping across the floor. His fingers brushed against something small and soft. A child's pajama sleeve. He'd found him. The boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, was lying on the floor near an overturned dresser. He was unconscious but breathing, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged spurts. Izuku didn't hesitate. He scooped the small, limp body into his arms, cradling him close to his chest, trying to shield his face from the worst of the smoke. He turned back towards the window, his only way out. But in the few seconds he'd been inside, the fire had spread. The doorway to the room was now a solid wall of roaring flame, and tongues of fire were beginning to lick up the walls, consuming the wallpaper. The smoke was getting thicker, hotter. The distant wail of the sirens was much closer now, a chorus of approaching help. But they wouldn't be in time to get him out. He was on his own. He stood up, the child a precious weight in his arms. He took a deep, smoky breath and leaped back out the window, using his own body to shield the boy from any remaining shards of glass. He landed heavily on the branch, his ankle twisting, a sharp, real pain shooting up his leg. He ignored it. He scrambled down the tree, his movements clumsy but effective, and landed on the soft, damp grass of the backyard, away from the main blaze. He ran, limping, until he reached the relative safety of the street out front, where a crowd of neighbors had gathered. He burst through a hedge just as the first fire engine screamed to a halt, its red lights painting the scene in frantic, strobing colors. He stumbled forward and gently placed the unconscious child into the arms of a paramedic who was rushing toward him. He was on the second floor. Izuku gasped, his throat feeling like it was full of sandpaper. Smoke inhalation. The paramedic, a woman with a calm, professional face, immediately went to work on the boy, shouting for an oxygen mask. Firefighters, clad in their heavy gear, were already storming the house, their hoses spraying powerful jets of water into the inferno. Izuku stood there, swaying on his feet, his body screaming with a dozen different kinds of pain. His shoulder ached from his landing, his leg throbbed, his lungs burned, and his hands and arms were covered in scrapes. But all of that was nothing compared to the vast, hollow cavern that had opened up in his chest. The single life he had saved felt utterly, horrifyingly insignificant. He hadn't been a hero. He hadn't swooped in and saved the day. He had been a pallbearer. He had arrived just in time to bear witness to the end, to feel a woman's life be brutally snuffed out. The face of the small boy, now being treated by paramedics, wasn't a symbol of his victory. It was a monument to his failure. It was the living embodiment of the person he couldn't save. He saw the boy's face and all he could feel was the ghost of the mother's terror. The single rescue felt like a cruel cosmic joke, a consolation prize in a game where the only real prize was impossible to win. Then, a new presence made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A familiar, tired voice cut through the noise of the scene. Midoriya. Izuku turned slowly. Shota Aizawa stood 10 feet away, his hero costume on, his capture weapon hanging loosely at his side. He must have been on patrol nearby. His face was unreadable, a mask of grim neutrality, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, intense fury that was more terrifying than any shout. He took in Izuku's disheveled state, the soot on his face, the wildness in his eyes, the slight limp. His gaze was an indictment. You have 5 seconds to explain what you are doing here, off campus, using your quirk, and interfering with an active emergency scene, Aizawa said, his voice dangerously quiet. Izuku opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? I knew they were going to die, so I came to stop it. The ticker told me to? He sounded like a madman even to himself. All he could do was stand there, trembling, the weight of the dead woman and the impossible burden of his curse pressing down on him, crushing him. Aizawa's eyes narrowed. That's what I thought. He strode forward, his movements sharp and angry. He didn't grab Izuku. He didn't yell. He simply stood in front of him, a figure of absolute, disappointed authority. You're a student. Not a hero. You are not licensed, you are not trained for this, and you are a liability, he said, each word a precisely aimed dart. You broke every rule we have, and for what? To play the hero? You're lucky you didn't get that child killed along with yourself. Every word was true. Every word was logical. And every word completely missed the point. Izuku wasn't playing the hero. He was running from a ghost. He was fighting a war no one else could see. You don't understand, Izuku whispered, the words ragged. Then make me understand, Aizawa retorted, his voice sharp. But Izuku just shook his head, looking past his teacher at the burning house, at the flashing lights, at the small child being loaded into an ambulance. Aizawa sighed, a sound of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. You're a danger to yourself and others, Midoriya. You're confined to campus. Indefinitely. We're done here. He was apprehended. Not like a hero, but like a delinquent. He was escorted back to UA, a silent, grim procession under the streetlights. As they walked, he could see his classmates' faces pressed against the windows of the common room, their expressions a mixture of confusion, awe, and worry. They had seen him leave. They had heard the sirens. Now they saw him return under the stern guard of their teacher. The first true wedge had been driven. They saw a reckless boy who had saved a child. They saw a hero in the making, maybe one who bent the rules, but for the right reasons. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the boy who had felt a stranger's soul extinguish in his mind and was now a walking, talking graveyard. They saw a victory. He only felt the loss. The official story, the one sanctioned by Principal Nizu and delivered by Aizawa with all the warmth of a coroner's report, was that Izuku Midoriya had acted on a reckless but heroic impulse. He had been on an unauthorized late-night run when he'd smelled smoke, and his instincts, honed by the USJ and Kamino, had taken over. He was praised for the life he saved and simultaneously condemned for the dozen rules he had broken. The punishment was severe, indefinite campus confinement, a suspension from all practical hero training, and a series of essays on hero ethics and protocol that would take him weeks to complete. To his classmates, it was a confusing but ultimately inspiring narrative. Deku, the boy who couldn't stop himself from saving people, had done it again. He was a folk hero in their midst, a cautionary tale wrapped in a success story. They offered him sympathetic looks, clapped him on the shoulder, and told him how brave he was. Kirishima called him manly, even in his rule-breaking. Uraraka looked at him with wide, admiring eyes, telling him she was glad he and the little boy were okay. Each word of praise was a hot brand on Izuku's soul. They were celebrating a single, hollow victory while he was still choking on the ashes of the real, profound failure. They saw the one life saved. He felt the ghost of the one lost. He would smile weakly, thank them for their support, and retreat into himself. The chasm between his reality and theirs widening with every well-intentioned comment. His punishment, meant to be a corrective measure, became an incubator for his obsession. Confined to the campus, stripped of his ability to physically train, his world shrank to the four walls of his dorm room. And in that confined space, his secret, horrifying work began in earnest. His room transformed. It was a slow, creeping change at first, then a cascade. The cheerful all-might memorabilia was the first thing to be altered. Posters were taken down, not out of disrespect, but to make room. The grinning face of his idol was an unbearable counterpoint to the grim data he was collecting. He carefully rolled them up and stored them in his closet, replacing them with maps. First, it was a detailed map of the Mizurufu prefecture. Then, a map of Japan. Within a week, a large, political world map covered most of his main wall. He bought spools of colored thread and boxes of pushpins with his allowance. A red pin for a violent death. A black pin for an accident. A white pin for a natural or medical death he could somehow confirm. Blue thread to connect incidents that might be related. A series of gang-related deaths in one city. A string of accidents on a notoriously dangerous highway. His desk, once a tidy space for schoolwork, became a command center. His Ueshu laptop was flanked by two cheap, second-hand monitors he'd bought online, creating a triptych of glowing screens. One was permanently tuned to a mosaic of international news feeds, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, NHK. The second ran a constant, scrolling feed of emergency service trackers, police scanner forums, and seismology reports he'd learned to access through illicit software. The central screen was for his own frantic research, a chaotic dance of open tabs and search queries. His death ledger was always open. Its pages, once filled with neat, analytical script, were now a frantic scrawl of times, locations, and sensory descriptions. 1432 Japan Standard Time Mail, 60s, Construction site fall, Kamigawa surprise, crushing force confirmed via Kanagawa Prefecture Safety Report. Red pin, 1701 Greenwich Mean Time female, 30s, London, anaphylactic shock tightening throat, panic, fading unconfirmed, no news. 2147 Pacific Standard Time multiple, 5, Los Angeles, quirk violence heat, concussive force, terror confirmed via news alert. Cluster of red pins. He was no longer just a passive receiver. He was an active, obsessive archivist of global tragedy. He was chasing ghosts, not to lay them to rest, but to pin them to his wall, to force their ephemeral, psychic whispers into a concrete, visual pattern. He operated under the frantic, desperate delusion that if he could just collect enough data, if he could just stare at the patterns long enough, he could find the algorithm of fate. He could learn to predict the spikes, to see the connections, to get ahead of the ticker. He could prevent another failure like the house fire. Sleep became a casualty of this new war. He would doze in his chair for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, his head lolling against his chest, only to be jerked awake by a fresh chime of death from halfway across the world. The concept of a full night's rest was a forgotten luxury. He lived on convenience store caffeine drinks and high-energy jelly packs, delivered discreetly by a worried but uncomprehending Ida. His physical appearance deteriorated at an alarming rate. His already lean frame grew gaunt. His skin took on a pale, almost translucent quality, the dark circles under his eyes so pronounced they looked like bruises. His green hair was an unkempt mess, and his eyes were the worst. They were constantly moving, darting between his screens, the maps, the door. They were the eyes of a soldier deep behind enemy lines, listening for the snap of a twig in the dark, knowing an attack could come from any direction at any moment. He looked haunted because he was. His room was a mausoleum, and he was its self-appointed curator. His friends, his family, his teachers, they all saw the decline. But they attributed it to the wrong causes. His mother would call, her voice thick with worry. "Izuku, you sound so tired. Are you eating? Are you still upset about the fire?" "I'm fine, Mom, really." He would lie, his eyes tracking a news report about a ferry capsizing in Indonesia, the psychic screams of the drowning a faint, sickening static in the back of his mind. "Just busy with the makeup essays Aizawa-sensei assigned me." Aizawa would check on him, his presence a sudden, silent shadow in his doorway. He would survey the chaotic transformation of the room, the wall of maps and string, the multiple monitors. He saw a boy spiraling, processing his trauma in an unhealthy, obsessive way. "Midoriya," he said one evening, his voice flat. "Staring at tragedies won't undo them. This isn't productive, it's research." Izuku replied, not looking away from his screen, where he was trying to triangulate the location of a serial killer whose escalating malice he could feel beginning to coalesce in the northern prefectures. "For my ethics essays." Understanding context, it was a weak lie, and they both knew it. But Aizawa, bound by a need for concrete evidence, and perhaps a sliver of pity, let it slide for the time being. He couldn't confine him any further than he already was. All he could do was watch, and wait for the inevitable breaking point. The wedge between Izuku and his friends became a canyon. He stopped eating in the common room altogether, claiming his essay deadlines were too tight. He'd grab a jelly pack from the kitchen and retreat back to his cell, leaving a wake of concerned whispers behind him. "He's been in his room for 3 days straight," he heard Mina say once, her voice hushed. "He looks like a ghost," Kaminari added. Did Aizawa-sensei really give him that much homework? They didn't understand. They couldn't. How could he explain that their cheerful conversations about training and movies were an unbearable distraction from the vital, life-or-death work he was doing? Their laughter felt like an insult to the hundreds of deaths he'd catalogued that day. Their vitality was a stark, painful reminder of the fragility he was now forced to confront every second of every day. He wasn't just isolating himself from them. He was quarantining them from the plague of his own awareness. One rainy afternoon, he felt a new kind of build-up. It was a cold, methodical feeling, not the hot panic of an accident. It was the precursor to a calculated act of violence. He focused on it, tracing the feeling. It was centered on a major bridge in the city, the Tensei Bridge, a massive suspension bridge that was a major artery for traffic. The feeling wasn't about one death, it was about many. It was a cold, sharp intent, a desire to create chaos. He scanned the news, the police trackers. Nothing. This was pre-crime. This was the storm gathering. He could feel the malevolent thought process behind it, a villain with a vibrational quirk, planning to destabilize a key support pylon during evening rush hour, not necessarily to kill, but to cause a multi-billion-yen disruption and make a name for themselves. The deaths would be a secondary, but accepted consequence. A multi-car pile-up on a collapsing bridge. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. This was the kind of event his system was designed for. He couldn't race there himself. He was confined. But he could still act. He could be an oracle. He used the cheap, prepaid burner phone he'd acquired for this exact purpose. He downloaded a voice modulation app, pitching his voice down into a gravelly, anonymous rasp. He knew he couldn't call the police. They would demand his identity, triangulate his position. They would ask questions he couldn't answer. He needed to contact someone who was equipped to deal with predictive, unorthodox information without getting bogged down in protocol. There was only one choice. Sir Nightie's agency. All Might's former sidekick was known for his logic, his efficiency, and his own prediction-based quirk. If anyone would take an anonymous tip about a future event seriously, it was him. His finger trembled as he dialed the public number for the Night-Eye agency. A crisp, professional voice answered. Night-Eye agency, how may I direct your call? Izuku took a breath, and the modulated, gravelly voice of Oracle spoke for the first time. There will be an attack on the Tensei Bridge this evening, between 1700 hours and 1800 hours. The target is the southern support pylon. The villain's quirk is vibrational. You need to clear the bridge. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, who is this? How do you have this information? That's irrelevant. Oracle Izuku rasped, his own heart pounding with adrenaline. Just be there. He hung up, his hand shaking so badly he dropped the phone. Had he done enough? Would they believe him? The doubt was agonizing. He spent the next 2 hours in a state of high alert, his eyes glued to the screen showing a live traffic camera feed of the Tensei Bridge. The psychic build-up of the villain's intent was still growing, a low, ominous hum in his mind. He was right. It was going to happen. At 16:45 he saw them. Unmarked black cars began to block the entrances to the bridge. Pro-heroes, not just from Night-Eye's agency, but others, including Fat Gum and Ryukyu, began to appear, subtly evacuating the last of the civilian vehicles, citing a sudden, critical need for a structural inspection. Izuku watched, breathless, his face inches from the screen. They had listened. They had believed him. At 17:23, the attack came. A figure emerged from a maintenance hatch near the base of the southern pylon. Izuku watched as the villain, a man in a grubby jumpsuit, placed his hands on the massive concrete structure. The camera feed shook violently. But the bridge was empty. The heroes were ready. They descended on the lone villain in a swarm of controlled, professional force. The fight was over in less than a minute. No one died. No cars plummeted into the bay. No lives were lost. For a single, glorious, intoxicating moment, the ticker in Izuku's head seemed to go silent. The background hum of global death faded away, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. He had done it. He hadn't just saved one life. He had saved dozens, maybe hundreds. He had stared into the abyss, and for the first time, he had made it blink. A wild, hysterical laugh bubbled up in his chest. He slumped back in his chair, a giddy, light-headed relief washing over him. It was possible. He could fight this. He could win. The relief lasted for exactly 7 seconds, and then the ticker came back. It returned not with a whisper, but with a roar. As if his moment of triumph had made him hyper-attuned to the alternative, the background hum of mortality surged back, louder and more insistent than before. And with it came a fresh spike, a new chime, sharp and clear and utterly unrelated to his victory. A child, no older than 7, falling from a balcony in a crowded apartment complex in Spain. The brief, weightless terror. The sickening, final impact. The mother's scream of pure, soul-shredding anguish. The chime of that single, pointless, accidental death completely and utterly erased his victory. His success on the bridge was a grand, strategic maneuver. But this was a random, tragic accidental world away. It was a stark, brutal reminder that while he was focused on one fire, 1,000 others were burning, unseen and unchecked. His triumph curdled into ash in his mouth. He hadn't silenced the ticker. He had just momentarily distracted himself from it. His victory wasn't a grain of sand on an infinite beach. It was a single drop of fresh water in a salt-poisoned ocean. It didn't change the nature of the thing itself. The giddy laughter died in his throat, replaced by a dry, hacking sob. He leaned forward, his head in his hands, the weight of the world crashing back down on him with redoubled force. The ghost of the Spanish child's death clung to him, a cold, sticky residue. He had saved 100 faceless strangers, but he felt the loss of this one unknown child more acutely than any of their phantom lives. It was in this moment of profound, post-victory despair that the knock came on his door. It was a soft, hesitant knock. "Deku?" Uraraka's voice was gentle, laced with a worry that had been growing for weeks. "Ida and we brought you some dinner. You haven't come out all day." Izuku froze. His friends. His connection to the normal world he was so desperate to protect and so terrified to be a part of. He couldn't face them. Not now, not when he was covered in the psychic viscera of a dead child. "I'm not hungry," he called out, his voice a hoarse croak. "I have to finish this essay. Please, just leave it at the door." There was a silence. He could feel their presence on the other side of the door, their shared concern a palpable warmth that felt like a burning poker against his cold skin. "Okay," Uraraka said finally, her voice small and hurt. "But we're worried about you, Deku. You're shutting everyone out." Then, Ida's more forceful voice. "Midoriya, this isolation is detrimental to your mental and physical well-being. As your class representative and your friend, I must insist that you open the door and have a proper meal with us." Their concern was a kindness he couldn't bear. It was a light shining into the dark, tomb-like world he had built for himself, and he flinched away from its brightness. He was raw, overstimulated, and balanced on a knife's edge of sanity. Their insistence, born of love, felt like an attack. He snapped. He shot up from his chair, strode to the door, and wrenched it open. The sight that greeted them made them both recoil. He was a scarecrow of a boy, his eyes wild and red-rimmed, his clothes rumpled, his face a pale, skeletal mask of exhaustion and anguish. Behind him, the room was a madman's den, a web of maps and strings glowing in the cold light of the monitors. Uraraka gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ida's rigid posture went slack with shock. They weren't just looking at a tired student. They were looking at someone who was fundamentally unwell. "Leave me alone," Izuku said, his voice a low, dangerous growl he had never used with them before. The sheer force of his despair and frustration poured out of him. "You don't understand. You can't help. You're just noise. So please just go." The word noise hung in the air between them, a poison dart. He saw the hurt flash in their eyes, clear and sharp. Uraraka's face crumpled, tears welling up instantly. Ida looked as if he'd been slapped, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. He hadn't just hurt them. He had wounded them. And the pain radiating off them was just another sharp pang he had to endure, another psychic chime he had caused himself. It was a self-inflicted injury, and it hurt more than any of the phantom deaths. Without another word, he slammed the door in their faces, the sound echoing the final, definitive closing of a chapter in their friendship. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, listening as their shocked silence turned into retreating footsteps. He was alone again. He had his system, his mission, his one hollow victory. And he had the ghosts. So many ghosts. He had chased them, and in the process, he had become one himself, haunting the edges of a life he could no longer live. The slam of the door was a physical event, a shockwave that radiated outwards from Izuku's room. For Uraraka and Ida, it was a sound of absolute finality, the closing of a door that had always been open to them. They stood in the silent hallway for a long moment, the tray of food on the floor between them a pathetic, rejected peace offering. The hurt was a sharp, physical ache in Uraraka's chest. Ida's rigid posture, usually a source of gentle amusement, was now a brittle frame holding in a storm of confusion and distress. They had tried to reach their friend, and he had not only pushed them away, he had branded them an annoyance, a noise. They retreated, not with anger, but with a profound and chilling sadness. The boy they knew was gone, replaced by a haunted stranger wearing his face. On the other side of the door, Izuku slid to the floor, his back against the wood, his head in his hands. The echo of the slam reverberated in his skull, mingling with the ever-present hum of the ticker. He had done it. He had protected his mission, his terrible and necessary work, by sacrificing the very thing he was supposedly fighting for, his human connections. The pain he'd seen in their eyes was a fresh, hot spike in his consciousness, one he couldn't pin to a map or cross-reference on a news feed. This one was his. He had created it. The guilt was a thick, cloying smoke, and for a moment, it was more suffocating than any of the phantom deaths. But the ticker was relentless. A moment of self-pity was a luxury he couldn't afford. A new chime, a stabbing in a back alley in Rio de Janeiro, pulled his attention away from the ache in his own heart and back to the global litany of sorrow. The guilt was subsumed by the grim, familiar routine. He crawled back to his desk, leaving the ghost of his friendship behind him in the hallway. The work had to continue. There was always another ghost to chase. The incident became a point of no return. News of the confrontation, whispered in worried tones, spread through Class 1A. The divide between Izuku and his classmates solidified. They no longer approached his room. They spoke about him in hushed voices, their concern now tinged with fear. They saw him in the hallways or during the brief moments he was forced to appear for class, a wraith gliding through the world of the living, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen horror. He was no longer just intense Deku. He was something other, something broken. This new, stark isolation did not go unnoticed. And it drew the attention of the one person who had always viewed Izuku's self-sacrificial tendencies not as heroic, but as a dangerous, idiotic flaw. Katsuki Bakugo was not a subtle observer. He didn't watch from the corners or whisper with the others. He watched with a predatory stillness, his crimson eyes narrowed, taking in every detail of Izuku's decay. He saw the gaunt frame, the haunted eyes, the way Izuku would flinch at nothing. He saw the way the extras in their class gave him a wide berth. He had known Deku his entire life, had watched him evolve from a sniveling, quirkless weakling to a powerhouse who was somehow always one step ahead. But this wasn't evolution. This was a regression. This was a rot. He cornered him in the gym. Izuku had been granted limited, supervised access to the training facilities, a concession by Aizawa who likely figured physical exhaustion was a healthier form of self-destruction than whatever Izuku was doing in his room. Izuku was there, not to practice his moves, but to push his body to its absolute limit, hoping the burn in his muscles could drown out the ceaseless whispers in his mind. He was mindlessly pummeling a reinforced punching bag, sweat flying from his brow, his movements sloppy and inefficient, driven by frantic energy rather than technique. "You look like shit." The voice was a low growl from behind him. Izuku didn't startle. He'd felt Bakugo's angry, explosive energy approaching from a mile away. He let his arms fall to his sides, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and turned to face his lifelong rival. Bakugo stood with his arms crossed, his usual aggressive slouch radiating an unnerving seriousness. There was no sneer on his face, no mocking glint in his eyes. He looked unsettled. "I'm fine, Kakin," Izuku said, the lie so practiced it was automatic. "The hell you are?" Bakugo shot back, his voice rough. "You look like one of those goddamn ghosts from a horror movie. You think I can't see it? You think any of us can't? You walk around like you're already dead." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "I saw your face after that fire. And I saw you when the news about Belgium came on. You think I'm stupid? This isn't about All Might retiring. This is something else. Something's broken in you." Izuku flinched. The word broken hit too close to home. He turned away, ready to dismiss him, to retreat back into his shell as he had with Uraraka and Ida. "It's none of your business." That was the wrong thing to say. In a flash, Bakugo closed the distance, his hand shooting out to grab the front of Izuku's sweaty gym shirt. He yanked him forward, their faces inches apart. Izuku could feel the heat radiating from Bakugo's palms, the faint, crackling promise of an explosion held in check. "It is my business, you damn nerd!" Bakugo snarled, his voice a furious whisper. "I'm supposed to be the one surpassing you. I'm supposed to be fighting you at your best. But you're not even fighting anymore. You're just fading. Whatever this is, whatever bullshit martyrdom complex you've cooked up in that creepy room of yours, you're losing. You're letting it win." Bakugo's words were a brutal, unexpected assault. He wasn't mocking his weakness. He was furious at him for it. He saw Izuku's obsession not as some noble, heroic burden, but as a pathetic surrender. It was a harsh, unflattering mirror held up to his face, forcing him to see his own reflection through Bakugo's mercilessly clear eyes. He didn't see a hero chasing ghosts. He saw a coward running from the real fight. "Stop trying to carry the whole damn world," Bakugo growled, his grip tightening. "It's making you weak. Pathetic. Fight what's in front of you, Deku. Or there'll be nothing left of you to fight." He shoved Izuku back, a look of profound disgust on his face, and then turned and stormed out of the gym, leaving a stunned Izuku standing in the echoing silence. The confrontation was like a blast of ice water. It didn't heal anything, but it shocked him out of his spiraling self-pity. For the first time in weeks, he was forced to consider his quest from an outside perspective, and the view was horrifying. Bakugo, in his own explosive, abrasive way, had seen the truth. Izuku had abandoned the path of a hero to become a full-time victim of his own quirk. The encounter left him raw and shaken, but it was nothing compared to the meeting that awaited him that evening. All Might summoned him to his office. It was a small, unassuming room on the faculty floor, a far cry from the grandiosity one might expect from the former symbol of peace. It was a room for Tashinori Yagi, not All Might. The man who sat behind the desk looked smaller and more fragile than ever, his oversized suit hanging loosely on his skeletal frame. The air in the room was thick with a heavy, paternal disappointment. "Young Midoriya," he began, his voice raspy. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please sit." Izuku sat, his posture rigid, his hands clenched in his lap. He felt like a child called to the principal's office. He couldn't meet his mentor's eyes. He stared at a crack in the plaster on the wall instead. "I've spoken with Aizawa," Tashinori said softly. "And with young Uraraka and young Ida. They're worried, Izuku." "I'm worried." He paused, waiting for a response that didn't come. Izuku remained silent, a stone statue of misery. "This obsession, this isolation," Tashinori continued, his voice laced with a pained confusion. "The maps, the news feeds. Aizawa believes you're suffering from a severe form of post-traumatic stress, compounded by a hero complex. He thinks you've developed a fixation on tragedy as a way of processing what happened at Kamino." He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his bony hands clasped together. "I know the burden I've placed on you is immense. Perhaps it was too much, too soon. I thought my job was to teach you how to use One for All, to be a symbol. But I see now I've neglected to teach you how to be, well, how to be human, and carry this power without it breaking you." He was trying so hard to connect, to offer the wisdom and platitudes that had once been the bedrock of Izuku's world. He spoke of bearing heavy burdens, of the strength it takes to ask for help, of the importance of leaning on friends. Each word was a testament to his own heroic ideals, the ideals that had defined him. And Izuku couldn't tell him the truth. How could he look this man, the man who had sacrificed everything in the name of saving people, and tell him that his grand legacy, the sacred torch of One for All, had mutated into an instrument of pure, passive suffering? How could he explain that the quirk meant to inspire hope was now an engine that mainlined despair directly into his soul? It would be a betrayal. It would be like telling a devout priest that his god was a malevolent, cosmic joke. The ticker was a constant, low hum in the back of his head, a morbid counterpoint to All Might's hopeful words. A peaceful death in a hospice care facility in Canada. A violent, sudden end from a quirk misfire in a back alley in Nairobi. The world kept dying, even in the office of the greatest hero it had ever known. "The power of One for All has always been about more than just strength," All Might said, his voice earnest. "It's the combined will of all its users. The indomitable desire to save, Perhaps what you're feeling is an echo of that, amplified by your own incredible empathy. You feel the world's pain more acutely than anyone. But you must learn to build shields, my boy. You cannot let the entire world's sorrow pour into your heart. It will drown you. He was so close, and yet so infinitely far from the truth. He saw it as a metaphor. Izuku was living it as a literal, moment-to-moment reality. The conversation was a dialogue of the deaf, two people speaking different languages about the same horrifying subject. "I'm trying," Izuku whispered, the words tasting like ash. It was the only truth he could offer. The meeting ended with no resolution. All Might gave him a folder with contact information for top quirk-related trauma specialists. Izuku accepted it with a numb nod. He walked out of the office feeling more alone than ever. He had looked his idol in the eye and lied through omission, creating a new, deeper chasm between them. All Might felt like a failure as a mentor, unable to reach his struggling successor. Izuku felt like a monster, hiding the true, horrifying nature of the gift his hero had bestowed upon him. The empathy that had once been his greatest strength was now a plague, infecting and destroying every meaningful relationship he had. The breaking point of this plague came during a revised, non-practical training session the next day. Aizawa, in a grim attempt to reintegrate Izuku into the class dynamic, had designed an exercise focused on search and rescue theory and teamwork. They were in the collapsed city simulation of the unforeseen simulation joint, the very place their class had first been blooded. The objective was to work in pairs to map out a disaster zone and identify the locations of simulated victims, mannequins equipped with heat and sound signatures. Izuku was paired with Uraraka. The moment Aizawa announced the pairing, a knot of pure ice formed in Izuku's stomach. He glanced at her. She was trying to smile, a weak, watery attempt at normalcy, but her eyes were filled with a pained apprehension. The memory of him slamming the door in her face was a raw, open wound between them. "Okay, Deku," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Let's do our best." He just nodded, unable to speak. They moved into the rubble-strewn landscape, a tactical map held between them. The exercise was simple. One person navigated and logged locations while the other used their senses and quirk to locate the victims. But for Izuku, it was torture. Being this close to her, forced to work in tandem, was an agony he was wholly unprepared for. His quirk, the ticker, didn't just transmit the sensation of death. It had made him hyper-aware of the fragility of life. It was a subtle, terrifying side effect he was only now beginning to understand. When he looked at a stranger on a news report, he felt their eventual, abstract end. But when he looked at someone he cared about, someone whose life force was a bright, familiar flame in the psychic landscape, the awareness was infinitely more potent. He looked at Uraraka, and he didn't just see his friend. He saw 1,000 potential deaths. He saw the way a loose piece of rebar teetered precariously on a pile of rubble above her head, and his mind instantly simulated the feeling of it falling, the crushing impact, the sudden darkness. The ticker supplied the sensation, a phantom spike of pain that made him gasp. "What is it? Did you find one?" she asked, turning to him. "No, nothing," he choked out, his eyes darting to the rebar. It was stable. It wasn't going to fall. But he had felt it. They continued walking. She used her quirk to lift a large slab of concrete to check for a mannequin underneath. For a split second, her control wavered, the slab dipping precariously. And Izuku felt it again, the scenario of her being crushed, the dusty finality of it. He flinched back, a strangled cry catching in his throat. The slab settled safely. Uraraka looked at him, her brow furrowed with deep concern. "Deku, what's wrong with you? You're as white as a sheet." Every step with her was a walk through a minefield of potential tragedies. A loose wire could electrocute her. A secondary tremor could trap her. A misstep could send her tumbling. His quirk, his curse, presented him with a branching, holographic display of every possible, gruesome end she could meet in this single environment. It was an empathy plague, transforming his care for her into a source of pure, unrelenting terror. He was actively, horribly pre-feeling her death, over and over again. They approached a darkened, collapsed tunnel. "There's a heat signature inside," Uraraka said, pointing. "I think there's one in there. I'll go check." She took a step towards the gaping maw of the tunnel. And as she got closer to the darkness, the phantom scenarios in Izuku's mind intensified, the potential for a collapse, for suffocation, for 100 other unseen dangers screaming at him. He couldn't take it anymore. As she moved to step past him, he flinched away from her with a violence that shocked them both. He stumbled back, his hands held up as if to ward her off, his face a mask of abject terror. "Don't!" he gasped, his voice trembling. "Don't get too close." Uraraka froze, her hand outstretched. The look on her face was one of complete and utter devastation. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was a deep, fundamental confusion, as if the laws of physics had suddenly ceased to apply. This was Deku. Her friend. The boy who had saved her from the giant robot, who had fought alongside her, who had always been a source of warmth and safety. And he was looking at her like she was a monster. "Deku, what did I do?" she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. The sight of her tears, caused by him, was the final straw. The wall he had built around his secret crumbled, just for a moment, under the weight of his guilt and terror. He had to make her understand, even if it was just a fraction of the truth. He took a ragged breath, the words tumbling out in a pained, frantic rush. "It's not you, Uraraka. It's me. It's this." He gestured vaguely to his own head. "Being near people I care about, it's agony." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "The ticker, it shows me. I'm so hyper-aware of how fragile you are. Of all the million ways you could die. Right here. Right now, I can almost feel it happen. And I'm terrified. I'm so terrified of one of those feelings being real. I'm terrified of feeling your death." He confessed it. The terrible, secret side effect of his curse. He didn't just feel the world die. He was forced to imagine, in visceral, sensory detail, the deaths of everyone he loved. His love for them had been weaponized against him by his own quirk. Uraraka stared at him, her tears forgotten, her expression shifting from hurt to a dawning, horrified understanding. The strange behavior, the isolation, the haunted look in his eyes, it all clicked into place in the most awful way possible. He wasn't pushing her away because he was angry or broken. He was pushing her away because he cared too much. She took a slow, deliberate step back, giving him the space he so clearly, desperately needed. She wasn't retreating out of fear of him, but out of a sudden, profound empathy for the unimaginable horror he was living through. "Oh, Deku!" she breathed, the words barely a whisper. The name was no longer a symbol of his potential, but a lament for his suffering. The empathy plague had claimed its latest victim, not by destroying a relationship, but by twisting it into a new and terrible shape. He was no longer a friend to be approached, but a tragedy to be pitied from a distance. And as they stood there, separated by a few feet of rubble and an immeasurable gulf of pain, Izuku knew that this was his new reality. To protect the people he loved, he had to keep them forever at arm's length.